Good afternoon, everyone. I will just wait another minute for additional people to join. And maybe if we reach 55 people, we'll start the webinar. I hear my volume is a bit soft. I hope the sound is a bit better now. I'll try to speak closer to my mic. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of our white paper, not position, but white paper. The paper is Understanding APAC's LDT Regulations. The paper is available on our website, and I will be sharing it again in the chat a bit later. So just to share our agenda for this webinar, we'll be starting with an introduction of APAC Med, since this webinar is open to all of you and not only APAC Med members. So starting with introduction, then Catherine, our knowledge partner for this white paper, will be sharing the overview of the paper, what are the findings and some of the best practices that we recommend. And then we'll be moving to a panel discussion and Q&A with our panelist authors who contributed to the paper. So throughout the session, we won't be allowing people to come off mute. If you have any question, please either type them in the chat, or we have a Q&A function as well, and we'll be taking them during the last part of the webinar a bit later. Also wanted to mention that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be shared with all of you post-event. So just to share a few words about APAC Med in case you're not familiar with our association. So APAC Med is a regional trade association representing the medical device and IVD companies across the APAC region. We are headquartered in Singapore, but we have two offices as well, one in China and one in India. And our mission as a trade association is to improve the standards of care for patients in the region. So through the work that we do and the collaboration that we have with all the different medtech stakeholders. The work that is done at APAC Med is done through the different committees and working group that we have. So you can see 6 of them on the screen. And this webinar today is brought to you by the one of the biggest and oldest committee that we have, which is the Regulatory Affairs Committee. Just to mention some of the work and resources that we have at APAC Med, and that either as member or non-members you have access to. We have, for instance, an e-learning hub, which is an online learning platform where we put a lot of modules, mainly for now looking at regulatory affairs. This is a great resource if you want to learn about medical devices and medical devices life cycle, especially in the regulatory affairs space, and it's available to all of you. We publish either monthly or quarterly bulletins and newsletter, either looking at regulatory intelligence, government affairs, market access, and others. We have white and positioned papers that we publish regularly on key topics. So for instance, this LDT white paper that we publish is an example of it. And then we have dashboards looking at other aspects of medtech. So more recently, we published a dashboard looking at ESG, but we have some looking at cybersecurity policies available, market access policies, and others. So all these resources are available on our website and in our integrated resource hub. Again, many of these are available to all of you, so feel free to tap into our resources and use them whenever it's relevant for you. All right, that's all for my introduction. So I will hand over to Catherine for the part you are the most interested in. So Catherine is a partner at Ropes & Gray, and as I mentioned, Ropes & Gray was our knowledge partner for writing this paper. So yeah, over to you, Catherine, to present our paper and findings.
Thank you, Cindy. And it's a real pleasure and privilege to be able to work with the APAC Med IVD working group on this LDT white paper. So today it's a good opportunity to actually share our insight with a broader audience. I would like to take this opportunity to actually go through this white paper in a very high-level overview, and hopefully it will be a good discussion starter to solicit more insight and more important comments on this research project. So let's turn to the next slide or start with a formal presentation. Yes. So yeah, can we move to, well, the structure of my presentation today is divided into 4 sections. We will start with an introduction that gives a clear definition of LDT as opposed to IVD and research use only reagent. And we're also going to give you a summary of the existing regulatory challenges associated with the regulatory framework. Some countries do not really have a very well-established frameworks. Some countries have a more established framework. So we're going to summarize the challenges that are faced by the IVD manufacturers as well as the labs. And the second section of this presentation, we're going to give you a quick overview of our research finding after reviewing the legislation in 14 different APAC countries. And there are 3 countries that we are going to have a deeper dive with a focus on how its LDT regulatory framework is currently structured. The third part of the presentation, we will actually use the US and EU as 2 reference jurisdictions to compare and contrast how LDT regulatory frameworks in those 2 markets look like. The last part is the most important part of this white paper, which is the recommendation proposed by APAC MED members on what an ideal LDT regulatory framework should look like. The principle is a risk-based regulatory framework, but we're also going to touch upon the key elements of this framework. So let's move on to the next slide. So to give everyone a quick overview of what this LDT topic actually means in the context of reagents. So there are basically 3 main types of diagnostic testing. The first one is IVD. And IVD actually are commercially available medical devices. They are registered and approved by the national health authorities for clinical diagnosis. And there is also another type of reagent that is called research use only reagent, which usually are not available for commercial or clinical diagnosis. It's mainly for research purposes. So they are not subject to the same regulations that IVD reagents would be subject to. So between RUO and IVD, there is this, I would say, third category, which is lab developed test, LDT. And LDT are actually developed, manufactured, and used within a single licensed clinical laboratory or chain of laboratory that is controlled by a single entity. And it's also used for clinical diagnosis. They are usually developed in response to emergent public health needs or rare diseases. And this is actually the topic of our presentation and discussion today, because in Asia Pacific, not every country has proposed a very clear and comprehensive regulatory framework that governs LDT. And this is, I would say, an important area that we think the regulators should look into. So let's move to the next slide. The current challenges that APAC MED members believe exist in the market are basically the following. Many rare diseases actually do not have corresponding IVDs to address the clinical needs, but there are actually clinical needs and it has to be attended to. So labs would develop clinical diagnosis tests using some reagents that are actually not clear for such rare disease, but it will be very important to respond to patient needs. And right now, if there are LDTs developed and manufactured at labs, they are not always subject to the same regulatory scrutiny as IVDs. So potentially the quality of the LDTs are not always consistent and the accuracy of the result is not always reliable. So there are actually public health challenges in the current situation that needs to be addressed by the regulators. So as a result of that, APAC member companies decided to pick up LDT as a discussion topic. And this white paper outlines the regulatory frameworks that currently available in each of the APAC markets. So we will provide a summary of the regulatory framework. And also there are examples in other markets, especially in the US and EU, on how LDTs are regulated. So we summarize the existing regulatory landscapes in those developed countries for reference. The last part of the white paper is trying to propose some, I would say, recommended principles in the regulatory framework that regulators in the APAC markets can consider when they develop a system for LDT regulations. So let's turn to the next slide, please. Yeah, so now we're going to give everyone a quick summary of what the regulations of LDTs in APAC markets look like. So in this white paper, we actually try to approach the regulatory systems in each of the markets in a more consistent methodology. So there are basically elements of the regulatory frameworks that we would like to approach and also present in a comparable table in the white paper. And that will probably be of a better use to the readers of this white paper. So the first element of comparison start with the definition of LDTs. And then we're going to look at how the LDTs are classified within the regulatory framework and the roles and the functions of the regulatory authorities, especially with respect to the labs and also the reagent suppliers. If there are any requirements for marketing authorizations or registrations of the LDTs, what the process will look like in each of the markets, and what are the requirements of post-approval surveillance. And the last part is what is the standard and requirement for quality management systems in those key APAC markets. So in this white paper, we examine 14 different countries, and we're going to highlight China, Australia, and Singapore as an example, because those three countries actually have a more established regulatory framework, but they also vary in different ways. So let's turn to the next slide. So in a nutshell, actually, you could see on the slide that the 14 different APAC countries have different approaches to LDTs. Some countries actually have not defined LDTs in law or regulation at all. Some countries actually have not defined LDT, but they regulate clinical labs. And there are also countries where do not have a clear definition of LDTs, but LDTs are regulated indirectly if they have an intended use that are similar to IVDs. And there are also countries like China, Australia, Singapore, and Taiwan, where LDTs are regulated by the health authority through a process that is very similar to how IVDs are regulated. So let's turn to the case studies now. The first one in the next slide is China. So in China, actually, LDTs are defined in the medical device regulation. And there is actually a pilot program rolled out by the China NMPA that basically describes LDT as a lab-developed test that can only be available if there are no commercial equivalent substitutes. So basically, the LDTs will be developed at the healthcare institution when there are no replacement of therapies that are approved by the NMPA. And NMPA actually supervises the products, basically including the filing of the pilot LDT tests and also the quality management system adopted by the clinical research labs, whereas the National Health Commission supervises the medical institutions, including the use of the LDT at such clinical lab. The product marketing authorizations are actually overseen by the NMPA and NHC, the National Health Commission jointly. So any medical institution that is qualified for the pilot program, they should file an LDT product with their local or provincial medical product administrations. After they got the approval from both the medical product administrations and the health authorities, then the pilot medical institution can begin the LDT process. And the label must clearly indicate that this is an IVD reagent only for use within the particular institution. So this is actually an important attribute of many LDT regulations in the APAC markets, because this LDT product is not supposed to be manufactured at commercial scale to be supplied to other medical institutions. In terms of post-market surveillance, actually the NMPA will conduct post-approval inspections at the medical institutions to ensure that the LDT meets the requirements and also comply with the filing documents. And most importantly, the development and manufacturing process must comply with the GMP requirements. And that in terms of the quality management system, the development and the production process for LDT, as I said, will need to comply with the GMP requirements. And if the production is outsourced to a third party, to a contract manufacturer, then the manufacturer will need to hold a medical device manufacturing license in China. So again, the quality management system requirements for LDT is very close to what it is applicable to IVD products. So the next case study is Australia, and let's turn to the slide. So in Australia, the definition of LDT is regulated by the TGA in Australia. And it's, again, very similar to IVD framework. They are called in-house IVD. So there are a lot of similarities in how LDTs are regulated in Australia compared with IVD products. It's defined as a pathology test that is developed or modified and validated within a lab or a lab network. And it is used for clinical diagnosis or clinical management within that lab or in the lab network. So the regulatory authority for LDT in Australia is NATA. It basically oversees lab quality management system, and it will also accreditate labs. There are 4 types of LDT tests. It's risk-based. So the class 1 and 3 LDTs are represented by a lower risk level, and class 4 LDTs, if they are actually used in clinical settings, they must comply with the essential principles and conformity assessment. And they also need to be included in the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. So in terms of the marketing authorization process, when it's classified as a lower to moderate class of LDT, then the labs will have to provide the TGA with a notification. And then the lab will have to be accredited by NATA, either to the ISO 15189 standards or the ISO 17025 standards. So this is actually management in a similar approach like the IVD products as well. But if the lab is manufacturing a class 4 IVD, basically the same standards will apply to the LDT if it's classified as a class 4 products as well. So it will have to be accredited by NATA, and also they will have to apply for a manufacturing license. And in terms of post-market surveillance requirements, the labs are required to have a post-market system for ongoing monitoring of all the in-house IVD performance. And they also need to inform TGA of any adverse events or field actions. On the quality management system requirements, the class 1, 2, 3 IVDs, they are basically LDTs. They must actually be accredited by NATA and also meet the NPAAC standard and establish the QMS system in the lab. If it's a class 4 LDT, they need to comply with the TGA conformity assessment, obtain the certificate, and then be included in ARTG in order to be used in clinical settings. So this is actually how Australia regulates LDT. And if we look at Singapore, Singapore also, like China and Australia, has provided a definition of LDT. So LDT is defined as IVDs that are used for clinical diagnosis, and they are developed and manufactured within a licensed clinical laboratory for use in that same laboratory. The regulatory authorities of LDT in Singapore is the Ministry of Health that regulates the clinical labs, and HSA in Singapore regulates the products, the actual LDT products. The product marketing authorization process is for the clinical lab to notify the Ministry of Health, and then they will have to basically notify on a specified portal with a list that they intend to use in clinical settings in their lab. In terms of the post-market surveillance process, the regulations actually apply to the clinical labs will also apply to the manufacturer of LDTs. So the clinical labs developing the LDTs are responsible for reporting adverse events and also reporting and implementing the field actions. Such actions should be reported to HSA, including the recalls and all the associated, I would say, follow-up actions with the use of the LDT. In terms of the quality management system, clinical labs that develop and use the LDT for clinical diagnosis purposes, they are considered as manufacturers of the medical devices. So the labs will have to be registered with the Ministry of Health, and then the quality management system requirements are actually applicable as if they were producing medical device products. So the clinical labs will have to document their rationale for using the LDT instead of commercially available IVDs using objective checklist. And the design and the manufacturing process of the LDT should also be carried out in accordance with the corresponding ISO standards. So this is actually a good summary of what is the regulatory, I would say, landscape in Asia Pacific. And let's take a look at how LDTs are regulated outside of APAC. We use the US and EU as case studies. So let's first start with the United States. So in the US, actually, the US FDA has proposed legislative initiative to regulate LDTs as a form of IVDs. So basically, LDTs in the US under the FDA guidance, they are defined as products intended for clinical use, and they're designed, manufactured, and used within a single clinical laboratory that meets certain laboratory requirements. So under this new rule, because it's regulated in a very similar way to IVD devices, the LDTs will be subject to pre-market clearance or approval based on their risk classification. And they are also subject to certain post-approval controls. And the quality management system requirements will apply to LDT to the extent relevant. But they are not actually subject to the same control as IVD products because there are certain types of LDTs that the FDA decides where the cost of compliance would outweigh the benefit to public health, then some of the requirements that apply to higher risk LDTs will be waived on those LDTs. In terms of the clinical lab, they must be certified under the CLIA requirements or standards. And this certification is foreseen by the Center of Medicare and Medicaid Services. There are actually 5 different stages in the FDA's enforcement plan on how this new rule will be rolled out. But actually, according to the latest status, there are a lot of stakeholder groups for clinical labs that were not in agreement with the FDA's approach of LDT. So they have filed legal actions against the US FDA and trying to actually suspend the implementation of the FDA rule. The litigations are still ongoing and the results haven't been really finalized. And the Trump administration hasn't been very clear on its position of how the US FDA will regulate LDT. So in the US, I think the original phase 1 rollout deadline is by May of this year. If the litigations are still pending and the Trump administration didn't announce any executive order, this may still become a moving target. So let's take a look at how EU regulates LDT. So in the European Union, they are in the process of rolling out the medical device regulation and the IVD regulation. And an LDT under the current regulation in the US is defined, in the EU, sorry, is defined as a device that is manufactured and used only within a health institution established in the European Union. And this health institution could potentially be a hospital or a clinical lab, basically that are performing clinical services on patients. And LDTs are potentially exempted from some general medical device regulation and IVD regulation requirements if they can meet certain conditions that are summarized on the slide. So the conditions, as you can see, basically responded to the attributes of LDT. It is actually designed and developed and manufactured for use in one clinical institution. So it's not intended to be manufactured at commercial scale for supply to another health institution or legal entity. And basically, the clinical substitute is not available for this particular medical need. That's why there's a legitimate need to have LDT developed by a clinical institution. And the ISO standards that are applicable to medical devices are also applicable to the manufacturer of LDT. And for high-risk LDT, the documents must be prepared on the manufacturer, design, and performance of this LDT, including its intended use, and be retained by the clinical institution. So before the actual IVD regulation are fully implemented in the EU, those regulatory requirements and criteria are still applicable to LDT today. So going to the last section of our white paper, which is actually the proposed considerations for APAC regulators when they develop a regulatory framework for LDT. There are actually some elements that APAC MAD members feel strongly about, and I would like to go through those elements with the audience today. So let's move to the next slide. So the first element of this framework is to have a clear definition for LDT. And it's actually very important to clearly demarcate LDTs from IVDs and RUOs. Otherwise, it's very confusing and potentially arbitrary for the regulators to actually take positions on how LDTs should be administered. The second element is to have transparency and accountability in the regulatory system, because as everyone could already see from this presentation, there are regulators' responsibilities, but there are also responsibilities to be divided between the reagent suppliers as well as the clinical labs or clinical institutions. So in this regulatory system, in the total product life cycle, what are the roles and responsibilities of different stakeholders has to be very clearly prescribed. And because labs are usually regulated by a different health authority than the authority that is responsible for the regulation of LDTs or the in-house IVDs, it's also important to actually divide the responsibilities between different government agencies if this is an area that requires co-regulation. In terms of the scope and criteria, it's important to actually identify what are the local clinical needs and the market dynamics when regulators approach what types of LDTs will fit the interests of their patients. So it is important to draw a fine line between public health interest and patient safety when they decided to allow the LDT manufacturers or the clinical labs to develop LDTs for unmet patient needs. In terms of the regulatory systems, it's important to design a very, I would say, appropriate and risk-relevant pre-market and post-market regulatory roadmaps. So in terms of the pre-market pathway, we strongly recommend that regulators in the Asia-Pacific region should consider a risk-based approach, because similar to IVD products, LDT products are also classified based on their potential risk to clinical needs or patient needs. So it's actually ideal to have a risk-based regulatory framework and subject to different types of LDTs to different regulatory control and requirements. In terms of, let's move to the next slide, please. In terms of product quality, actually, it's very important to have reliable and effective LDTs because they are also used in response to public health emergencies as well as rare diseases. So what quality control requirements would be put in place during the total product life cycle is something that the regulators should think about. On the topic of post-market surveillance, again, the members of APAC-MED advocated that it should be also reflecting the product risk classification, including what the adverse event reporting obligations should look like and what are the reporting processes that should be put in place for the clinical labs to actually bring the issues to the regulators' attention. That should be probably adapted to the different classification of the LDT products. If it's not an easy task to roll out a very comprehensive framework at once, APAC-MED members recommended that regulators may consider designing a pilot program when they try to refine the regulatory systems for LDT products. And the last part is very important too. It's all about collaboration and communication. The regulation of LDT is not a single agency responsibility. It involves many different stakeholder groups and potentially competing interests. So it's important for the regulators to actually open up the legislative process for the industry and for all the stakeholder groups to contribute their ideas to. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for the opportunity. And I think we're probably going to move into a panel discussion. So I hope my panelists are all ready for interactive discussion.
Thank you, Catherine, for the great presentation. A lot of information, I think, in the slides. It was covered in a really great manner. So I hope the audience liked all of this content. Just wanted to mention as well that all of the slides will be made available to all of you. Again, it's a lot of content, so you'll be able to digest it at a later time as well. So the slides will be shared, the recording will be shared as well. And just wanted to mention that we'll be moving to panel and Q&A section right now. So if you have any questions I mentioned, feel free to either type them in the chat or use the Q&A section. And we hope we'll be able to cover them during the webinar. So just wanted to introduce you to our three panelists for this part. So we have Yasha Huang, who's the head regulatory policy, Asia Pacific and global regulatory policy and intelligence at Roche Diagnostics. Yasha is also our RA committee vice chair. Chrissy Huang, head of regulatory affairs, emerging market at Ascensia Diabetes Care, also leading some of our initiatives and projects. And Charles Lim, regulatory affairs manager at Thermo Fisher Scientific, also leading a few of our initiatives. So I will stop sharing my screen for the panel session and leave the floor to Catherine and the panelists.
Thank you, Cindy, and welcome to the panel discussion, Yasha, Chrissy, and also Charles. I have actually a few questions, and I hope we can go through those questions one by one. So my first question is, what kind of challenges are we facing in markets where there's no clear LDT definition or there's a lack of proper regulatory oversight for LDT?
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Happy to take this one.
Yeah.
And I welcome the rest of the panelists to also jump in, because I think it's exactly the challenges that brought us together to launch this project, and it has been over a year already. So there are actually a number of challenges. If I prioritize them, I think the biggest one is what's the unknown. We don't know the risks because of the lack of transparency when it comes to LDT, right? Especially in those countries when there's no definition and also a lack of oversight. So then we really don't know what's going on. So then because of that, a lot of times the providers or the patients also don't know if, you know, some of the test results actually were based on the tests that were not, let's say, cleared by a regulatory authority. So that could potentially cause a lot of the risks for our patients, because nowadays a lot of the LDTs are used for clinical diagnosis, right? So that result would be then led to some clinical treatment decisions. So that could then cause, a really major problems, so potentially. So secondly is then because of the lack of regulation, so we have seen some issues when it comes to product safety or efficacy, because a lot of these tests have not been properly validated, and or there's no proof on the clinical validity, for example. So this potentially, again, right, pose a lot of risks. And then actually, addition to that, we have other challenges. So from some of our member companies, right, and they're also, let's say, RUO manufacturers or importers. So what we observed is in markets where there's no clear definition of LDT, that tends to be over-regulation of RUOs. So a lot of times, actually, it's not the RUO manufacturer or importer's responsibility to, really guarantee there's no misuse of the RUOs. But then because there's no LDT definition or regulation at all, then the regulators can only regulate these RUO or these raw material suppliers, right? So we thought that's also not fair for these players. So these are just some examples of the challenges that we see. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Yasha, for sharing your thoughts. And I clearly agree that it's the challenges that brought us together to work on this white paper. So my next question to the panel is, why is it important actually to look into LDT regulation? Are there any, I would say, imperatives that the working group is trying to address momentarily?
Thank you, Catherine, and also thank you, Yasha. So this is Chrissy. So actually, the questions is coming again. I will say we'll be delighted to more emphasize that why we wanted to build up this paper, right? So as Yasha mentioned just now, we are facing a lot of the challenges in the market using the LDT products, but actually also in the recent years, so we can see more and more increasing use of the LDT, specifically after or start from the COVID period, right? So, but looking into this challenge around the market, so we will see that it will be very important to consider some framework from the regulatory standpoint. So to address the issue that we already observed from the market. So firstly is the main concern is unclear of the regulatory requirements or even the over-regulatory policy in some of the country. That will lead to the limitation on the development and the use of the LDT product on the market. And it definitely will prevent the patient have the access to the clinical benefits from these products. And also it will hide or give the difficult time for the innovation, the technology innovation on the market, and also the R&D by the laboratory or the manufacturers. And the second, to address the concern, it's because the lack of this clear regulatory system, that means the safety and validation data of the LDT will not be transparent and not be assessed by the patient or and they cannot be reviewed by the regulator in a scientific view or manner. That means the confidential of this clinical data actually is not really build up the strong foundation when during the clinical usage. So as a result, definitely we will see that the potential risk will, based on the patient safety or the public health, will be present using the LDT product in this case. So yeah, combining all these challenges we see, that's why we are trying to take this opportunity to look up into the LDT regulation and also to help to provide some observation or our recommendation when the regulatory related to start building up the regulatory system in the country.
Thank you, Chrissy.
Back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Chrissy. I think actually for the benefit of the audience, we have look into the regulations of 14 different countries, but in my presentation, I only cover 3 key countries with a more comprehensive regulatory frameworks. I wanted to give Charles the opportunity to actually take us through some of the other countries' existing regulatory landscapes and tell us what are the similarities and differences from his perspective.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Good afternoon, everyone. So actually, indeed, yes, we have identified several similarities and differences observed during our work. And actually, the similarities are the base result that we accumulate together to do our risk-based framework. So firstly, related to the similarities, right, we have noted that there is actually a QMS requirement that is called out repeatedly for laboratories. And usually, right, the ISO 15189 was the standard that was especially called out. Definitely, of course, there are different other national standards or ISO requirements called by other or different countries, but this ISO 5189 is the specific ISO standard that we see that is repeatedly calling out from the different regulations. Next, regarding the second similarities, right? I just want to echo out in Catherine's presentation about risk-based approach. So we have seen that there's a risk-based approach, right? Especially on the pre-market side. For example, higher risk products in Australia for LDTs, right, or in-house IVDs are required to go through more intense scrutiny by the health authorities. Same goes for US and EU regulations as well. Also, for post-market surveillance area, right, we have noticed that different regulatory bodies, right, that have LDT regulations also call out for post-market obligations from the laboratories who are doing the LDT up. So this is pretty much intuitive because they want the authorities want to ensure continual public health and safeties are in check, right? Following that, there are 2 more similarities that we have identified. One of it is really on the records for audits, whereby there's expectations for the laboratories to keep validation and verification records for audit purposes, all right? And lastly, we have noticed that for EU, Australia, and Singapore, right, there's a call out for essential principle or GSPR. So this is something that for other countries who may want to come out with their LDT framework, that can be a starting point for pre-market control. Moving on for differences, right? This is a result of risk-based approach, especially at the pre-market side. As we can see, for because there's a higher risk products control, right? As a result, for example, Australia, right? We are looking at a less stringent requirement for class 1 to 3 products LTT as compared to class 4 assessment, right? However, counterintuitively, the Singapore requirements does not call out for any risk-based approach for the pre-market submission, right? It's pretty much standardized, right? And also for USA side, right, they are also categorized it for different LDT cases. So we can see that the pre-market approach for different countries are pretty different. Okay, and one last differences we have identified is that typically for LDT, we are always talking about looking for unmet need, right? But surprisingly, the unmet need was explicitly called out for at the EU side, but not so much for the other regulatory bodies. So this might be something that may be open for discussion for future work. And lastly, just to conclude, right, knowing the similarities and differences is really helpful for coming out with more future specific framework discussion. And because it helps us to know what are the generally accepted requirements are, right? And also to know what are the potential area of intense discussion, okay, moving forward, if let's say we have more LDT related work in the future. Thank you so much. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Charlotte. I think this is a very excellent summary of the, I would say, commonalities and differences of LDT regulation in Asia Pacific region. So thank you for the great summary. I think if I may actually ask the last question for all panelists or individual panelists to contribute, I would like to hear from you what, in your perspective, in Asia Pacific, that if there is a country that has close to ideal regulatory framework for LDT currently. So I don't know if any of the panelists would like to offer your insight.
Maybe I can go first, and if any other panelists would like to comment a bit more after that. Yeah, so basically from our previous conversation and also what Catherine introduced the paper right now, right? So from our current investigation, look out all the landscape across the APAC region. So we will say maybe what we call the ideal framework of this LDT regulation, we will propose it could be a risk-based control principle. So definitely the regulation would like to balance the patient safety, innovation, and also the regulatory oversight for the industry. But I think I will say at this moment, we are still in quite early stage, understand all the LDT requirements or the utilized in the industry. So maybe moving forward, we still need to have a more collaboration together with the regulator, laboratory, all the stakeholder, and try to find out the best pathway for the LDT regulation. But at this moment, maybe we can, from the case study we share with the team, right? So we can see like Australia, they already have the differentiate on the risk-based classification. So that means kind of that example we can look up into the future and have a more investigation if that is the most fit regulator system for the LDT in the industry. So that's my view. Is there any more else from our rest of the team?
No, thank you, Chrissy. I think we would agree. This actually is not an easy question as we studied all of these nuances in different markets, right? But I think Australia is a good example. As you mentioned, right, about the risk-based approaches, and also for the really the high risk, let's say the class 4, they regulate them exactly as the IVDs. So I think that's really the guarantee for our patients, right? Especially for this kind of high-risk products. And also the co-regulation seems to be working well, right? And they have all the elements in place, the quality management system standards, right? The accreditation for the labs, post-market. I think, definitely, I think they are more close to the ideal framework. Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Charles, do you want to add anything at the end, or we should open for Q&A?
Yeah, just a small part. Actually, yes, I totally agree with what Chrissy and Yasha has shared, because like what we have discussed just now, the Australia requirements as established now, right, is really very much similar to what our proposed risk-based frameworks are. So yes, that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you all, my dear panelists, for this interactive discussion. And I hope the audience also benefited from the insight of each of the panelists. And I saw from Cindy that we actually have a question from the audience. I can actually answer the question. I'll just read out the question for everyone first. So there's a question about cross-border use of LDT. So it was really specific to samples that are shipped to a country in the clinical lab for LDT testing. And I would say, participant would like to know if the country health authority has any oversight, since the patient samples may come from a foreign country. And in that case, from the patient's view, how would they protect themselves from any potential risks or liabilities in the destination country? So if I understood this question correctly, I think this question may have involved the cross-border transfer of patient biosamples. It's not necessarily specific to LDT test, but I think there usually will be country-specific regulations on how biological materials from patients can be collected and exported. So the process or procedure requirements for the collection and use and export of the biological materials will need to be complied with. And secondly, in terms of the clinical use by clinical lab for LDT development, if the particular destination country does not actually regulate the lab's conduct or activities for LDT purposes, then this area may be just broadly subject to generic regulation on medical practice. Because usually if a patient decided to receive clinical testing services at a lab that is in a different country, the patient has the right to actually use the samples for its own purpose at a testing lab that complies with the medical practice or the lab operational requirements in that destination country. I don't think, to my knowledge, there are laws in any country that would prohibit a patient from seeking clinical testing services using his or her own biological materials. So I think those two aspects are probably going to be the governing requirements for this type of arrangement. So I don't know if there are any questions from the audience that we can discuss today, or if not, I think questions can always be directed to Cindy at APAC Med, and we will be happy to take them on after the webinar.
Thanks, Catherine. And I think we had one or two others, but maybe that's something we can cover afterwards. So I have the name of the people who asked the questions, so I'll be reaching out after the webinar to help answer your questions. You can
Okay.
continue to type them in the chat if you have additional, or reach out to me by email, and I'm happy to circulate it to our panelists and Catherine as well. Thank
maybe,
you all.
sorry, Cindy, maybe as I think yeah, as we can see the questions in the Q&A section, and right, maybe if we still have a few minutes, I'd like to address some of those because these are very important questions. We want to make sure actually the audience also can understand it. So I have already typed some answers for some very straightforward questions. You know, like RUO versus LDT, right? So I think that's very obvious. And there was a good question actually about how, we have done perfect work, fantastic recommendations, how to translate that into action, right? Or how to activate this kind of, reforms in different jurisdictions. I think that's a great question. I think that's maybe what Cindy also would allude to later on, in the conclusion part, is about next steps, because definitely we know this is just the first step. The first step, the project team was trying to just build the landscape, right? We also looked into other markets, right, in the US and EU. So now at least we have the foundation, we have the knowledge about where's our starting point. So the next step is we're going to go to the markets, discuss with all the different stakeholders, and then try to work on the solutions together. Because I think only by collaborating with the different stakeholders, we can really make these changes happen. So I think definitely stay tuned on our plans. And then another one by Vivash, I think also is very important, is about the confidence, right? How can they have the confidence? As I mentioned in my previous answer, it's actually about transparency. If we don't know what we don't know, so we remain in the unknown. So of course, then the confidence comes from the unknown, because they actually don't know the samples have been tested using what kind of products. So I think that's the first thing we need to address, right? Also raise some awareness. So the transparency, as you can see from our paper, is one of the key asks. is one of the key elements in this proposed regulatory framework. Is we have to, make sure, for example, there's labeling and there's transparency for both patients and providers. I hope that helps. Thank you.
Perfect. So going to my my closing remarks, Yasha. Thank you for taking the last few questions. Actually, maybe I can share also some of the questions that we received. I'm happy to share them after. I will put them at the end of the presentation. So if people want to refer to the question and answer in the future, you'll be able to do so as well. So I will just share my screen one last time for a really simple slide on what's next. So I think, again, you will reemphasize some of the points that Yasha just mentioned, but what's next to all of you? I think we would really like to invite you to join our advocacy group. We mentioned the different stakeholders during the webinar, right? But we want to make sure all the voices are represented. So from the labs, the clinician, the patient groups, the government as well. We want to make sure that all are heard and that we continue to shape this future of LDT regulations together. In terms of collaboration and engagement, APAC Med represents medical device and IVD manufacturers, but not only. Some of the stakeholders that we just mentioned are also part of our members and part of the some of the groups and some of the meetings, events that we organize. So it will be really important that we build this collective approach to the regulatory framework that we want to build. So we encourage all of you to leverage our paper, our findings, and engage with other stakeholders. So the paper is available publicly. The recording of today's session and the slides presented will be available publicly too. So please use it, share it with your colleagues, use it when meeting with your regulatory authorities, with policymaker labs or others. Share these use cases and best practice from other markets. Yasha mentioned it's a first step to have this landscape and understanding basically what's going on in our markets, in our region and elsewhere. But we are planning to engage with regulatory authorities and others through additional capability building sessions that we'll be organizing through dialogues, closed door sessions. So if you're interested in supporting our message here, please stay in touch and let's work together to create this meaningful change and ensure that our patients have access to these safe and effective tools. So thank you very much, all of you, for your attention, staying so long with us for the whole session. I hope to receive messages from all of you to connect and continue the collaboration. And yeah, wishing everybody a great rest of the day. Thank you to our panelists and Catherine for the session as well. And yeah, let's stay in touch. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Take care.